It's great to have you with us. We understand that you have a new movie coming out, which is a bit of a departure for you. You have so many excellent books. In fact, first of all, maybe you should tell us about your new book on artificial intelligence.
My new book is called 2084. It's a takeoff from George Orwell, and it's really quite amusing because the title was suggested by none other than Peter Atkins, the famous atheist professor of chemistry at Oxford. We were going to a debate, which is online actually, where he was very opposed to me. But in the car, he said, "We're not going to talk about the debate. What are you writing?" So I told him, and he said, "I've got a title for you." I said, "What's that?" He said, 2084. Well, I said, "Peter, that's brilliant. If I use it, I will acknowledge you." And I've done that. Excellent.
I've had a very spirited debate with Peter myself on your BBC Radio 4 at one point, but that's terrific. So even our opposite numbers can be can add something to our work. So that's great.
Absolutely, because it just captured the spirit of what I wanted to do. Talk about both the AI that's working at the moment, narrow AI, its pros and cons, and to try to get people to see that they don't have to be afraid of everything, but there are huge ethical issues. And then to talk about this more speculative stuff, artificial general intelligence. So I'm very pleased to see that there's been a huge response around the world in terms of interest, and I've done dozens of Zoom calls and interviews about it.
That's terrific, John. So you can see the promise of AI as a technology without buying into the materialist metaphysical program saying that the machine is conscious and that the human mind becomes unnecessary. Is that?
Well, that's absolutely right. And I want to encourage young people who are scientifically gifted, particularly if they're Christians, to go into this field so that they can contribute some of the wonderful stuff that's being done in medicine, like the work of Rosalind Picard at MIT, but also can give folks insight into the ethical issues, for example, that surround surveillance technology.
Very good. That's a real concern for sure. Well, we're promoting this, and we'll be promoting it more on our Mind Matters website here at Discovery Institute. But let's shift gears back to the primary reason for our conversation with John this morning. We want to give our subscribers and viewers and supporters and followers a heads up on a really fantastic film that's coming out. It's a little bit of a departure for John. He writes technical papers in mathematics. He writes books about science and faith, and but now he's become something of a film star, working with none other than Kevin Sorbo, the actor who played Hercules. John's always been a bit of an intellectual superhero for all of us, but now he's actually teamed up with a real superhero. And I can tell you the conversations between the two of them are quite interesting. Kevin's quite up to date on these issues and about science and what it has to tell us about larger worldview stuff. So let's dive in there, John, and just with that introduction, maybe have you give us a little a background first on yourself, your career in math and in science, and how you've related that to your personal faith in God, because I know that you are a believer, and so maybe a little background on yourself, and then we'll segue from there into a discussion of the film and your life story and the way it tells that.
Fine. Well, I come from a very tiny country called Northern Ireland. And it's been made famous by people like C.S. Lewis. But unfortunately, it's rather infamous for sectarian violence. And I grew up when that was just starting. And some of the seminal influences on me when I was very young came naturally from my parents, who were keen Christian believers, but were very unusual because they were not sectarian. And my father ran a store, and he employed around 40 people, I suppose. And he employed people from both communities, the Protestant and the Catholic community. And he got bombed for it. And my brother was nearly killed by one of these bombs. And I once asked him, "Dad, why do you take the risk?" He said, "For this reason, that we learn from the Bible this fundamental mandate for civilization that all human beings have the dignity of being made in the image of God. And he said, I'm determined to treat them like that, irrespective of what they believe. And that became an absolutely fundamental principle for me throughout my life. The respect for people, even if you violently disagree with them, like Peter Atkins, whom I've mentioned. The second thing is they loved me enough to give me space to think. Not only that, they encouraged me to think about the Christian worldview, but also about other worldviews, and encouraged me to read very widely so that when I came up to university, I'd read not only of Christian arguments defending intellectually the veracity of the Christian faith, but I'd read quite a bit of philosophy and quite a lot of the opposition. So coming to Cambridge in 1962, I, in a sense, hit the ground running because I've read a great deal of stuff. And the basic conviction I had was Christianity is true, not simply helpful or emotionally supporting, but actually true. And therefore, my mathematics and my interest in science and philosophy are seen against the wider worldview picture of Christianity. And I learned very early on, even at school, that the two fitted together because I came across books on science and religion in the last few years of my high school. And so I was reading this kind of stuff. And it's interesting, Robert E.D. Clark, nobody's ever heard of him
I
these
have some
days.
of his old books, yeah.
Yes, well, I knew him in Cambridge and I'd read his books, and they helped me to see that there were serious problems with the atheistic interpretation of the universe and with neo-Darwinism and so on. So he put me on an intellectual track, I nearly said, from which I never recovered. But I don't want to recover
You never did. Now, if you came up to Cambridge in '62, then you would have overlapped with C.S. Lewis in the last year of his professorship before he died. Did you ever encounter him there?
I did indeed, yes. I had read a great deal of Lewis. I owe him an immense intellectual debt because I have no idea what it's like to be an adult and an atheist, but he had. And I needed some kind of mature guidance into what does it feel like to be in an atheist's shoes. And Lewis guided me also, although he was no mathematician. In fact, we nearly didn't have C.S. Lewis because of my field of algebra, because he failed his first attempt to pass the Oxford entrance exam in algebra, and the war saved him from having to resit it. And I dread to think that we might not have had Lewis because of algebra, but he had a brilliant mind, and he understood not so much science, but the implications of science. And that was a huge education to me from the humanities side, for which I am really indebted. And realizing he was there, but not knowing that he was very ill, I looked him up in the lecture list, and so he was lecturing in the lecture rooms just within 1 minute walk of the mathematics department in Mill Lane. And so I turned up and listened to him lecture for 2 or 3 of what turned out to be the last lectures he ever gave.
That's quite a legacy. I know you and I have both been influenced by Lewis's writing about the laws of nature. He has a wonderful little essay.
That's right.
Now published in God in the Dock, and then, of course, his writing in Miracles. And he has a brilliant exposition of why the laws of nature don't actually cause things. They describe patterns that we observe, but they're not the causes of things. And that's
it's immensely important. And what amazes me, Steve, is that there are very clever people. They don't seem to understand that. So the late Stephen Hawking never seemed to grasp that.
It's right. It runs right through all his work in what's now called quantum cosmology, the idea that the laws of physics can somehow explain the origin of the universe by offering a causal explanation for matter, space, time, and energy. But math doesn't do that. The laws of physics are written in math. Math describes the matter and energy within the universe once it's here, but it doesn't tell us where it came from. And
that's right. And it's like saying that Newton's laws of motion cause a snooker ball to go across a table, which is absurd.
Exactly.
It describes the motion, doesn't cause it.
Or it'd be like saying that the latitude and longitude lines on the map are responsible for the great height of the Himalayan mountains or something. It's not quite the same
that's
category.
Quite a good analogy, actually.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to the film itself. The title is really intriguing. It's Against the Tide. Give us what is the tide that your life has been running against in the sense the film is describing?
Well, I think it's essentially the tide of atheism, naturalism, materialism. It's a worldview tide, and it ebbs and flows,
right,
and goes in and out. But I found myself for most of my life in the academy, which is largely in the West, at least, dominated by naturalism. And I determined from the beginning that I would fight against that, not by compromising mathematics or even science, but by asserting them. And it's one of the great encouragements of my life to have lived long enough to have read books like Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, where he points out that the naturalistic interpretation of the universe risks actually demolishing human rationality and our use of it in science, which is an argument, as you well know, that Lewis foresaw. And that kind of thing confirms my stand. And it's similar to your own stand in the academic world. It's just important.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time to be a theist and a scientist and a philosopher. There's so many intellectual trends that are now moving against that tide that's been so dominant for so long. What was it like in the 1960s? And so we've had this, let me preface this question, we've had this publishing genre since about 2006, 2007, when Richard Dawkins came out with the God Delusion, and then there's been this spate of new atheist books, as they're called, right up to 2016, 17. I think Stephen Hawking even got in the act near the end of his career with books that were making these kinds of arguments, arguing that science properly understood undermines any rational basis for belief in God. This has been a more aggressive sort of scientific atheist polemic. But as you mentioned, this naturalistic worldview that has been around for longer than just the new atheism. And I wonder what it was like for you in the 1960s and 70s when you were starting out in your academic career. Was the atheistic tide as strong or as aggressive as it has become in the last few years with the new atheism, or was it more of a subtle undercurrent?
I think it was more of an undercurrent. And ironically, a lot of it in my early days at Cambridge was coming from inside professing Christianity in the honest to God debate and that kind of thing, so that many students were raising these questions, but it was more from the perspective, look, can we believe anything that Christianity claims? But there was still quite a lot of interest being generated. The arguments that I mentioned of R.E.D. Clark were of interest to people. There were lectures being held and so on. And I remember going to listen to people like John Polkinghorne in those early days, giving a rational defense of Christianity. Let's put it this way. There was great interest in rational defense of the Christian faith. It wasn't so much in the science religion area, but in the wider sense of rationality. And of course, we weren't crippled in those days by the prevalence of scientism, which holds that science is the only way to truth. At least people felt that history and philosophy were rational disciplines,
right,
and
right.
could be taken seriously.
So you were encountering the undercurrent of naturalistic thinking or materialistic thinking as much in the religious community as in the wider academic community. There was liberal theologians who were denying the possibility of miracles, Christian theologians who were denying the resurrection, or Jewish theologians denying the Exodus, or whatever. That was part of how you were encountering this underlying assumption that the material world is all that really exists and nothing could exist.
That's right. And the interesting thing is, what prepared me to encounter it is that in the 1940s and 50s, Lewis saw this very clearly. You mentioned his book on miracles. It is a brilliant refutation of naturalism. It's almost as if Lewis saw it was going to happen. And The Abolition of Man was a book that influenced me greatly, where he talks about this subtle way in which naturalistic worldview can be communicated even in an English textbook.
Right.
And it was creeping its way into the fabric of the academy. And having read those things, even as a schoolboy, I was certainly at a bit of an advantage when it came to entering the fray, which I did from the word go, actually.
You couldn't help yourself, John. It was built into the fabric of your being. So let's bring this up to date, because what was a subtle undercurrent or a kind of tacit presupposition among most academics has become much more explicit and aggressive with the advent of the new atheism, and with writers and scientists like Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Peter Atkins, several of these folks you and I have encountered, had interesting conversations with. How have you, tell us a little bit about your encounters with this more aggressive form of scientific atheism?
Well, for me, it was almost a quantum leap. I had several encounters at a much lower level, but things changed about a dozen years ago when it was Larry Taunton of the Fixed Point Foundation suggested to both Dawkins and myself that they'd like to hear a bit of the Oxford debate, as he called it, in Alabama. And
of all places.
Of all places.
Yeah.
It's a great place. I love being there. But that encounter with Dawkins, which was really formidable, almost overnight gave me a worldwide platform, which I've managed to retain. And the aggression, which I discovered doesn't characterize all atheists. I learned very rapidly that there's still some of the more old-style atheists who take the view that they respect but disagree with what I believe, whereas the aggressive Stew style is, we don't respect what you believe and we will mock it and ridicule it and all this kind of thing, which to my mind, as an academic, that means you've lost the argument before you start.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. For our viewers, that debate is definitely worth a look if you haven't seen it. It's online. And
there are bits of it in the film.
Exactly.
The film actually refers to several of those debates as part of
some of the spicier encounters in that exchange. Yeah, but we haven't mentioned this, but for people who don't know John's current position, he is a professor of mathematics at Oxford, and he's a fellow of the Green Templeton College in the philosophy of science. So he's both a mathematician and a philosopher. So his encounters with Dawkins were, in a way, poetically just two Oxford professors of diametrically opposed worldviews discussing the big question, and especially the central question about the reality of God and what science can tell us about that. From my point of view, I thought John did very well in the debate. But, we also very much appreciate, I do, these, in some ways, the new atheists are a different breed of scholar advancing a naturalistic or materialistic worldview. But there's something to appreciate about them. They have a gift for clarity in defining issues. Dawkins has been brilliant at that from his very first writing. His book, The Blind Watchmaker, began with, on the first page, with the central issue in biology. Biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And he defined the issue right there. It's the appearance of design or real design. In some ways, the intelligent design movement owes its origin to the clarity with which Dawkins defined that issue. So I've always appreciated them in another way. I mean, they're aggressive and they come right at you when you're in discussion, but they raise the central issues and they do it in a way that brings clarity as to what they're about. And I thought you handled it beautifully in making the opposite case. And so there's some of that in the film then, your encounters with
Oh, yes, there's some of that in the film, because that was something that interested Kevin Sorbo. Now, by the way, not as Hercules, but it is
yes,
right.
Just as himself.
And you were right to say that he's shown great interest and understanding of the things. And it was wonderful to get to know him, because I immensely enjoyed that interaction. And yes, we talked about the debates and went to where they were held and all this kind of stuff.
Well, the film does a great job of weaving your life story as a scientist and as a mathematician and as a person of faith into a fascinating narrative, and then it unfolds in this conversation that you're having with Kevin Sorbo in Oxford, and then eventually at the end of the film, you both go to Israel and the Holy Land. One of the things that I didn't know about you that I learned by watching the film was the number of visits that you made behind the Iron Curtain when it was still an Iron Curtain before the East Bloc was liberated. And tell us a little bit about that. And what motivated you to go there and give those lectures? And the film has footage of you in these kind of secret locations at the time. It was pretty fascinating.
It was extremely fascinating. And the origin of it, I think, so far as I can determine it, is I've been interested all my life in people that hold diametrically opposite worldviews to myself. Now, in the West, in England and the United States, one met it in the academy, but going to Eastern Europe opened up the possibility for me to see what this kind of worldview does in society, what its cultural effect is. And in the earlier days, in the 1970s, I frequently went to the German Democratic Republic. And of course, that was hard atheism, hard Marxism. And I mainly went there actually as a Christian teacher to the churches to encourage them, because they had very few intellectuals in the Christian ministry, for the simple reason that kids who would not swear allegiance publicly to the atheistic state at the age of 13 or 14 were not allowed to do any further study.
They couldn't go to university, right? Yeah.
No, they couldn't. So very few got to university. And so that was an immense learning curve and a huge privilege to do that. It was only after the wall fell that I started going to the former Soviet Union. But in those early days, I could see exactly the effect of atheism. And what it taught me was that people like Richard Dawkins and so on have not got a clue, not a clue. Otherwise, they'd be much more careful to evaluate their position. They are living really on the basis of the Judeo-Christian legacy in culture that founded the universities they worked in, and certainly Oxford and Harvard and many other universities around the world, and afford them the luxury of the freedom to speak about these things. But the philosophy they were spouting, and still are, would actually close that down. And you saw that actually happening in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So this was an immense opportunity for me, though I had no idea of it at the time, to be able to go out and face Hitchens and Dawkins and Peter Singer and all the rest of them with some kind of knowledge of what it's like to see this kind of stuff in practice.
That's excellent, John. You're mentioning your mention of the university as an institution, I think, is really important. It literally means uni veritas, right? One truth. And it was
yes.
The university was a Christian invention that was meant to explore the unity of truth under God. Our university, Harvard, has the motto for Christ and his church, and was founded by a Cambridge Puritan, John Harvard, who came to
Yes, he went to my old college at Cambridge, yes. Emmanuel.
Yes. You were at Emmanuel. Okay, wonderful.
Yes, I was. Yes.
So I mean, it's a very, when we think about going against the tide, the people who are men and women of science, who are also men and women of faith, we're not always going against this tide. Science started in a different milieu or intellectual context. And I know you've often said that you're not ashamed to be a Christian and a scientist because Christianity gave you your discipline. Tell us a little bit more about that.
That's absolutely right. And historians of science, like yourself, and philosophers of science, seem to be in wide agreement, with slight differences for nuances, the fact that there's an intimate connection between the monotheistic worldview coming out of Judaism and Christianity and the rise of science. And I couldn't put it any better than C.S. Lewis did when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, the Genesis account gave them the rationale to do science. They believed science could be done because it was the product of a rational mind, the mind of God, and they were made in the image of God, and so they could therefore do it. And that's one of my big objections to atheism, is it gives really no grounds to trust our rationality. I sometimes say these days, Steve, Christianity, Christian theism, and science ride perfectly well together. But I'm concerned about atheism and science. That doesn't seem to work together so very well. Although, of course, atheists can do brilliant science. And I discovered quite recently, actually, that between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners in science were believers in God. Mm-hmm. God is not dead in the scientific world. But the trouble is the general public don't know that.
It's absolutely true. And one of the key premises that I think gave rise to modern science, and which atheism threatens, is the trust in the reliability of the human mind.
That's correct. And that's very important.
Yeah, the whole idea that was important to Newton and Boyle and Kepler was the intelligibility of the world, that we can understand it because it was made by the same rationality, namely the mind of God, who made our minds in such a way as to understand the order and the lawfulness and the design that had been put into the world. And I think
Einstein was clever enough to see there was a problem when he said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. But that's where Christian theism, biblical worldview, gives a reason that atheism, by definition, cannot supply. And therefore, the explanatory power of Christian theism is very much more powerful than the atheistic worldview supplies.
In the film, you talk a bit about this, but you also talk not just about the presuppositions that come from the theistic worldview that made science possible, but also some of the discoveries of the last 100 years or so that are in a way pointing back to God. And this comes up very naturally in some of your several conversations with the on-air host Kevin Sorbo. But why don't we talk about, it might be good to talk about some of those discoveries. You talk a bit in the film about the discovery that the universe had a beginning. How does that affect our, what are the worldview implications of that in your view?
Well, to go back a bit, we mentioned I was in Cambridge in the 1960s, and I remember so well when the world of cosmology and physics was discussing the possibility of there being a beginning, which had been suggested by Georges Lemaitre, who was a Catholic priest actually in an earlier generation. But now the evidence was piling in. And one of the things that really struck me at the time was the editor of Nature, the most prestigious scientific periodical in the world, resisted this as one of the leaders of the United Kingdom scientific establishment. And he said something like this. He said, we can't afford to go down this road of a beginning because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe in a creator. Mm-hmm. And the irony of that is so obvious. One of the most brilliant discoveries of the 20th century, which led to the standard model of the hot Big Bang, was resisted because it seemed to parallel scripture. And I therefore feel, and Dawkins brought this up against me, he said, what's the big deal? I mean, either there was a beginning or there's not. And if you're guessing, it's 50-50. But I said, you know, it wasn't decided by guesswork. It was decided by brilliant science. And the conclusion was resisted. And to people that say, look, anything that comes from the biblical worldview is useless from a scientific perspective, I say two things. One, yes, the Bible is, technically speaking, pre-modern science. It is not a textbook of science, but it talks about the same universe that scientists study. And for centuries, while people were still buying into Aristotle's steady state universe that had no beginning, the Bible was saying it had a beginning.
Right up to the beginning of the 20th century, in fact. It was the default.
That's absolutely, well, up to 1960s, they had no evidence. Yeah. And I say that is a hugely important fact. And I dared to say at a conference, where I can't really tell you where it was or who was there, but some physicists of great fame got very cross with me and interrupted a little talk I gave. They said, Professor Lennox, please tell us you were joking when you said the Bible had something to say to us in the 21st century. And I said, I wasn't joking. In fact, I said, of course, I agree with you. The Bible is pre-modern scientific, but it's talking about the universe. And incidentally, if the scientific fraternity, the intellectual fraternity, had taken its worldview more seriously than it did, it might have looked for evidence of a beginning earlier than it did, because on the basis of the worldview, you could make a prediction. Just as on the basis of the Aristotelian worldview, the prediction was made is the universe was eternal. And there was a bit of silence after that. They hadn't quite thought of this. So therefore, I feel this is hugely important as a fact, which, at least with the modern state of science, there is a convergence. Of course, we know that science changes, but that's not the only issue it raises, because if there was a beginning, and I mean a beginning to whatever you think the whole thing is, a universe or a multiverse and so on, there's a finiteness backwards in time.
And energy, right.
Yes, there's a finiteness backwards in time. It raises the causal question. You cannot avoid it.
Absolutely, yeah. And if matter itself is part of what comes into existence, you can't offer a materialistic cause for the origin of the universe, because
that is so obvious that I know many professors who cannot see it.
Yes, I do know. I know a few myself, John, but I'm fascinated just by the way your own story intersects some of these great discoveries, because, of course, Hawking was in his PhD years when you were an undergraduate. And
correct.
He was writing his thesis on black hole physics, and he had that brilliant chapter 4 in his thesis about the Singularity Theorem.
Yes,
and
that's right.
And that was in a sense the mathematical proof of a beginning, that a development within theoretical physics that converged with all that observational evidence from astronomy to really cinch the point that the universe must have begun. And that happened in Cambridge when you were there. It's kind of
it did indeed.
Yeah.
It did indeed. And I remember Stephen Hawking. I never met him, but I remember him walking around with the limp that indicated, sadly, the onset of his disease.
Well, the other extraordinary discovery that was made in Cambridge was actually, there were two, and you discussed them both in the film, but was the discovery of the fine tuning. Sir Fred Hoyle, the great astrophysicist, spent a good deal of time in Cambridge, and he was one of the first physicists to realize how delicately balanced the universe was to allow for the possibility of life. All these different parameters that were just right. And I wonder if you ever encountered Hoyle, or if you could, in more general terms, just tell us about the fine-tuning of the physical parameters that make life possible, and what that has to tell us about the possibility of God.
The fine-tuning of the universe is hard science. And in the last, I suppose, must be nearly 100 years now, people realize that so many of the fundamental constants and fundamental parameters of nature have to be accurate to an astonishing degree of precision in order to have carbon-based life. And Sir Fred Hoyle, he was interested in carbon itself. How do you get so much carbon? And he predicted that there would have to be a certain resonance. We needn't go into what that exactly is. And really, I think, but maybe I'm biased, he should have got the Nobel Prize when that resonance was discovered. And he said that nothing had shaken his atheism so much as discovering that, as he put it, it seemed as if a super intellect had monkeyed with physics. And he had that sense, a profound sense of the whole thing was, did he call it a fix? Now, I did meet him. I met him later because when I was in the University of Wales, one of my colleagues was Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
Who was the astrophysicist or astrobiologist, as he calls himself these days. And he and Hoyle were very friendly. And Hoyle came down to Cardiff just after I had met Wickramasinghe. And Wickramasinghe had been off to the United States, where he'd taken part in a creation trial. I think you might have been part of that one too. And he said to me, it's a pity that people, they're so nice, he said, the Christians that I met, but they're so naive that they take the Bible seriously, you see. And I said, well, Chandra, so do I. And he looked at me with horror. And he said, you're not one of them, are you? Well, I said, I don't know. And he threw me the chalk. I'll never forget it. And he said, prove it to me. So I went to the blackboard and I wrote on his blackboard, and God said, let there be light. And he laughed uproariously. Yes, he said, you are one of them. This is absolutely naive. Do you think God has a voice box and lungs like we've got? Well, Chandra, I'll spell it out a bit more for you. So underneath I wrote, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things came to be through him. He said, what does that mean? Well, I said, Word, it conveys ideas of command, intelligibility, information. And he stopped. He said, did you say information? I said, yes, of course. He said, you're not telling me, are you, that the Bible contains the idea of information? Well, I said, you tell me, what does it look like? You see. And he said, does Fred Hoyle know about this? And I said, I haven't a notion. Well, he said, listen, the next time he comes down, I'll invite you to meet him and we'll tell him. So I said, fine. Well, Hoyle came down, and it was, so far as I recall, it was a famous occasion where he stood up and said that he'd done the calculations mathematically, and it was obvious to him, and it was an easy calculation. I have his notes actually here in the form he wrote them out, that evolution could never have produced anything on Earth because there just wasn't enough time. So he dropped the bombshell, life came from outer space, panspermia.
Yes, right.
And I've never seen, so there were hundreds of people there, of course, the whole academic cohort in Cardiff, there was a collective drawing of breath and all the rest of it. So I later met Hoyle with Chandra, and Chandra told him, and he said, what are you saying? I'm saying that one of the few but very important things that are said about creation is that it was a speech act, and God said, and this is summarized at the beginning of John's Gospel, and it's telling us that this is not a mass energy-based universe, as atheists claim. It's a word-based universe, which is the exact opposite. So that the biblical worldview is that word is primary, mind is primary, mass energy are derivative. The atheist worldview is the opposite. Oh, he said, the idea of information, I thought that only went back to Shakespeare. I remember this very well. And I said, well, it actually goes back 20 centuries to the New Testament. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to follow it up with him later.
Yes, or Psalm 19 in the Old,
Well, sure, yes.
Right, and pour forth speech. If you permit me, I had a little encounter with Hoyle myself as a first-year graduate student.
Oh, really?
He came to lecture on his ideas about panspermia. And after he was done, I came alongside him, and we were walking to one of the common rooms for a post-talk reception. And I started to ask him about his view of the origin of life and the information-bearing properties of DNA. And I asked if he thought that information in the DNA molecule might be providing evidence of a designing mind. And when I said that, he looked both ways and said, he kind of went, shh, and then he said, walk with me. And then he just began to jabber. And he was very intrigued with that idea. And of course, I was in the early stages of formulating my thoughts about intelligent design and what information implied. So it was really interesting. He was a very interesting figure. But that kind of brings us, in your whole discussion of the word, the primacy of the word, both in the universe and in life, to the third big Cambridge discovery. This one happened a little before your time, but it was still, the afterglow of that was still, I'm sure, very important in the 60s with the molecular biological revolution. But in the 50s, before you came up to university, Watson and Crick, of course, elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule. In 57, Crick puts forward the famed sequence hypothesis that argues that the DNA contains information in a digital form. And you in the film talk quite a lot about the importance of information to this deep worldview question of materialism or theism, which makes more sense. And I wonder if you could talk more about that from the standpoint of the reality of information in a biological context.
Well, to step back from that, you see, as a mathematician and some kind of a scientist, what you mentioned about the rational intelligibility of the universe is central. You cannot do science without believing that. And so science doesn't give you a rational justification, except for a pragmatic one. You've got to believe it before you start. Mm-hmm. The theistic Judeo-Christian worldview gives you a rational basis for believing that, as the pioneers of science thought. Now, if you carry that a little bit further, we're saying that we can describe, at least in part, some of the phenomena in the universe by using a highly compressed language, mathematics. It's words, very carefully defined and precise words. Now, to back that up, now within the universe, not within its description, but within its very biological nature, we find, to huge surprise when it was discovered, that the longest word of any kind is actually the human genome. In other words, here we have a chemical word and 4 chemical bases, and it's 3.5 billion roughly letters long. And I came across this, of course. R.E.D. Clark pointed it out and its significance. And I used to go around and visit him in Cambridge and talk to him about this. And I have never had the slightest doubt that this is one of the most powerful evidences of a designing intelligence. And the more I've studied it, even though I'm not a biologist, the more powerful the evidence for that grows. Because, of course, people have attempted now for a very long time, because it was also in the 1950s that they thought they'd discovered how life originated. If you remember the Miller-Urey experiment, where they passed a simulated lightning discharge through a cocktail of what they thought were the chemicals in the primeval atmosphere. They produced a few amino acids and so on. But that's 70 years ago. And origin of life research, as you know better than I do, has not progressed a whit, except to demonstrate that the difficulties are infinitely greater than Miller and Urey ever imagined. So I think this is a signature.
It's quite an irony, isn't it, John, that Watson and Crick make their discovery in April of 1953, the same year as the Miller-Urey experiment. So you have this great optimism about explaining the origin of life in the very year that the discovery is made that would ultimately produce an impasse in that field, because no one's been able to explain the origin of the information that's stored in the DNA molecule.
That's right. And my summary of the whole thing, you've written a book with a superb title that I would encourage everybody to read, called The Signature in the Cell, that I would expect from my reading of the biblical material that God has left a stamp on the universe. I mentioned earlier the dignity, the value that the fact that humans are made in the image of God give to humans. But Scripture goes further. It says that there's evidence of God's existence and his power in the things that are made.
Yes.
And we perceive them. And the interesting thing is, you quoted the blind watchmaker, that biology is a study of things that give the appearance of being designed. You just have to change that very slightly. They give that appearance. That is our perception, because that is the truth. They have been designed.
Absolutely. What do you make of the career of Francis Crick? He makes this extraordinary discovery. It's a discovery for the ages, and he goes further than Watson. They elucidate together the structure of the DNA molecule, but Crick is the first to realize that DNA is literally storing information in a digital form. This is his sequence hypothesis. He suggests that the nucleotide bases are functioning like alphabetic characters or digital characters in the machine code. And yet, he maintains a staunch atheism and materialism throughout his career. He's a code breaker in World War II. He breaks the ultimate code of life, and yet doesn't seem to be able to see the significance that you and I see in it. What do you make of that?
It's very hard to second guess what thoughts go on. One of the things that I believe Crick said in early days was that he attacked the problem of the nature of DNA to prove there was no God, which is absolutely ironic, because what he discovered is very powerful evidence that there is a designing intelligence. I just do not know. I did have an encounter with Watson, which was memorable, because he gave a talk and we were walking down the stairs in my college. And I quoted Crick to him. And I said, Professor Watson, Francis Crick once said that the origin of life was like a miracle. What do you think? He was quite angry, and he said, it happened, and he turned away, and that was the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, it's as if I'd hit a sore point. Why? It's strange in this world that when you raise the question of intelligent origin or God, people somehow get embarrassed. It's a bit like Thomas Nagel, although he's very different. He writes quite candidly, he doesn't want there to be a God. Well, of course, that's not a scientific position. So I don't know how to answer your question, but what I do know is that when Crick tried to explain on atheistic foundations the nature of human consciousness, he really began to talk nonsense. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, that you and your thoughts were simply a bundle of billions and billions of atoms and neurons and synapses. That's how he started the book. And then in the middle of the book, he said, you are essentially that. Well, of course, we know that we're composed of billions of atoms, but to say that we're only that, well, if that were true, we'd never know it, as many people have pointed out, and not only theists, but many philosophers have pointed out that we'd never know it. So I think he loses the plot when it comes to philosophy. Now, this is an important thing, and I'm sure that you can say a lot more about it than I can. Einstein once said something that lives with me and is a warning to me. The scientist is a poor philosopher. And you can see that in the writings of people like Dawkins and Hawking. They haven't a clue about philosophy. And, you know, I'm reminded that Lord Rees, who's our astronomer royal, was asked what he thought of Hawking's views on theology and philosophy. Well, he said, I know Stephen Hawking very well. And of course, he's a brilliant cosmologist, mathematician, and physicist, no question. But he said he knows very little philosophy and no theology, and I wouldn't take seriously anything he said about that. And we come up against, Steve, what I see as power play and authority play. That is, if I am a distinguished scientist, then I can speak on any topic in the world with authority. That is not true. And I'm constantly aware of that, because here I am talking to you. I'm a pure mathematician. I'm going outside my field. Now, that's risky business. It's risky for Dawkins. It's risky for me. So what do we do? And I find the first thing to do is check with the experts in the field. And that's where I have deep criticism of people like Richard Dawkins, who will quote as evidence of historical matters a retired professor of German and no ancient historian. I mean, that is just absurd. And so it's very important that we do our homework and be modest about our conclusions, but check with the experts in the fields that we're delving into.
Well, and a point that you've made very cogently a number of times is that very often these debates that are alleged to be scientists critiquing religionists or something are really, or scientists who might critique a scientist such as yourself who has faith, your opposite numbers will position themselves as making a scientific critique of you, but actually what's in play are competing worldviews.
That's right. And the important thing here, you say scientists like me who have faith, but we need to add, my faith is in God. Mm-hmm. And they are people of faith. There's a huge myth around in the world, and this is what they build on, that you and I were people of faith, and faith is believing where there's no evidence, so we're not worth talking to. I want to shout from the housetops that every single person is a person of faith. They have a worldview they believe in. And so when I talk about faith, I try to, I don't always succeed, to say faith in God. I've also got faith in the scientific method. And faith is something that operates in every area of life.
It's a really compelling point, John, that there's no worldview neutrality here. Everyone has a worldview. And yes, you see this in the writings of people like Hawking and Krauss and Dawkins. They will disparage philosophy and at the same time make an argument for a very naive materialistic philosophy for which there's virtually no evidence. And
it's even worse than that, Stephen. Yeah. Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, starts on about page 4 by saying philosophy is dead. And the rest of the book is an attempt at philosophy of science. Well, yes. I mean, that's
very poorly done.
Just absurd.
Right. Yeah,
but you're right.
Terrific physicist, fantastic cosmologist, really bad philosopher of science. And
yes.
yeah, and yet his public pronouncements are mainly in the mode of philosophical statements in defense of a materialistic worldview. And what I find fascinating, and we maybe should come back to this, is we've just been talking about these three big discoveries. The universe had a beginning. The universe has been finely tuned from the very beginning for the possibility of life. And then there have been these big infusions of information into our biosphere, making new forms of life possible. When I add those three things up, I think that they seem to have profoundly, they certainly point to a designing intelligence, but when you think about the fine-tuning being present from the very beginning of the universe, it looks to me like the best explanation is an intelligence of a transcendent kind.
Absolutely.
And so there's actually not only has Christianity and Judaism, the monotheistic worldview, brought presuppositions to science that have made science possible, but now we're finding powerful evidence within the natural world that's pointing to God, to the reality of God. And so I think it's on those terms that I'd like to have this debate with our new atheist interlocutors going forward, because they've assumed that there can't be any evidence, and then they proceed to
well, that's a very cheap anti-intellectual cop-out. And you made a point a few moments ago that's worth picking up on. The central issue is not science versus God. The central issue is the collision of two diametrically opposed worldviews, atheism and theism. And there are scientists on both sides of that.
Right.
And so the real question to be asked is, where does science point, if anywhere? Does it point, as Dawkins claims, towards atheism, or does it point towards a transcendent intelligence, as I would strongly claim? And there is where the debate is. And people who think it's science versus God, I say to them, look, this cannot be so, for a very obvious reason. And the obvious reason is that if you go to the top level of science, let's stick with physics and the Nobel Prize, you've got Peter Higgs, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, who's an atheist, one of the more pleasant atheists, actually. And then you've got the American physicist, whose name escapes me just at the moment, he's still alive, the low temperature physicist, who won the Nobel Prize, who is a Christian. Now, the fact that you've got those two people, their science doesn't differentiate between them. They both won the biggest prize that you can win. What the difference between them consists in their worldview. And unless we can see, and I think it's so important to get across the public that this is a worldview discussion, and we're bringing in evidence on which worldview you should believe. And
so it's a debate about which worldview provides a better overall interpretation.
Yes, explanatory power.
Right. The better, yes, exactly. It's an issue of explanatory power. And there, I think theism really has a decisive advantage. That's the case I'm making in a new book, and it's beautifully made in the film. This comes out.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Well, you do it so conversationally, it kind of goes down like butter. But I think it allows you've opened up a window to this great, big, and important question in the film: is God real or imaginary? As our friend Professor Philip Johnson used to say, was the most important question: is God real or imaginary? Yes. But then you talk about the different evidences that allow you to adjudicate that question, to assess it, and engage in that worldview debate, but not a worldview debate that's conducted purely in the realm of abstract philosophy, but rather the philosophy intersecting with the evidence, which what makes the film so
correct. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. John, just for the audience, how did you get involved in a film project like this? This isn't your usual.
Well, it actually
genre.
the idea came from a physicist, Steve Huff of the Pensmore Foundation, and he had read one of my books and looked me up in Oxford. I got this phone call. I didn't know who he was, and we sat down, and I found that he had been very interested in seeking for ways to explain to the public the deficiencies and inadequacies in naturalism. And we became friends, and he ran several conferences, and you took part in some of them, for example, in Westminster Theological Seminary. But I think what partly crystallized it was, there was a film made with Kevin Sorbo in the role of an atheist professor called God's Not Dead. And I saw this film, and to my utter amazement, it explicitly used some of my arguments.
They were quoting you.
They were quoting me in some detail. So Sorbo was faced by his student called Wheaton, interestingly, with arguments that came from me. And of course, I was absolutely astounded because I'd not heard of this before. And that led to the idea, slowly, it took quite a while, of making some kind of a film, and eventually, about my life, and eventually the notion of involving Kevin Sorbo. So we met together and we got on very well, and the rest is history.
So they made a film where they allowed you to make your own arguments for yourself then?
That's exactly right. The idea was to try and get the thing out in an interesting way that's got a bit of human interest as well. And so that is what has happened. And of course, we didn't restrict it to the science God discussion, because there comes a point, a turning point in the film, where Kevin said to me, look, you know, all this stuff is good, but you actually are Christian. How do you justify the step from theism to Christianity? Which is a very important question. So I turn around and say to him, look, the best way to deal with that is to go to where it all started. And so the rest of the book takes place in Israel, where we're dealing with the much more history and experience specific claims that Christianity makes. So it's an interesting kind of blend. I don't know whether it's been attempted before. People tell me it hasn't.
It's a completely new genre, as best I can tell. It's a part travelogue, part intellectual autobiography, part science documentary. It fuses all these three things beautifully, and you guys are much to be commended. It's really good. I'm going to just give a little plug for our audience with some information about how to get more information about the film. There's a wonderful website, againstthetide.movie, not .com, but .movie. And you can also follow our coverage of the film as it gets closer to release on evolutionnews.org. John, I think you've just had a fascinating career, and your voice is so important in this larger dialogue within our culture about what science can tell us about the reality of God. And we're just very proud to be able to give your film a bit of a plug, and the film succeeds beautifully in what you all set out to do. So thanks for joining us today for this interview, and we'll be sharing it with our audience, and we hope we can get a lot of people to go to the theater. When does it release? Is it?
I believe on November the 19th, but it's a one-night cinema release. I don't think it's there for any longer than that. You'd have to check on the website.
Right.
But November the 19th is the debate, and they're trying to encourage people to go and see it and all this kind of thing. But thank you very much for inviting me on. As usual, it's been with you a fascinating conversation, and I could see we could keep going for hours.
We have a lot more to discuss.
I'm sure there will be another time, but in the meantime, thank you very much for using your wonderful platform to support this.
Well, thanks for all you're doing, John, and we'll look forward to this release now in just a little over a month. So, and again, congratulations.
Well, goodbye.
Okay, goodbye. Nice to talk today. Yeah.
Why there is something rather than nothing is a huge question today.
Belief in God does not really help us.
Religion teaches us to be satisfied with not really understanding.
I believe the exact opposite. God, far from being a delusion, is real.
Religion is a fiction that just is never challenged.
I believe that the public need to hear that there is another side.
And that's why I'm here too, to have you help me to understand and follow the evidence.
I do argue that there is evidence for the existence of an intelligent God behind the universe. I'm convinced of it, not simply as a Christian, but as a believing scientist.